Epic poetry in the Old English period 450 to 1066. Assalamu alaikum everyone. I am Syed Mohsen Raza Rizvi. Welcome back to our History of English Literature lecture series. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss epic poetry in the Old English period. My dear students, before we begin today's discussion, I want you to remember one very important thing. As I always tell my students, whenever you study the history of literature, never try to memorize isolated facts. Instead, always try to understand the connection between history, society, culture, religion, and literature. Literature never develops in isolation. Every literary work reflects the age in which it was produced. Therefore, if you understand the society of a particular period, you will automatically understand the literature of that period much more easily. Today we are going to begin our journey from the very first stage of English literature, which is known as the Old English period. This period is extremely important because it represents the birth of English literature. Every great literary tradition has a beginning, and for English literature, that beginning lies in the literature of the Anglo-Saxons. Now I want you to understand this concept carefully. The Old English period extends roughly from 450 AD to 1066 AD. Please pay special attention to these dates because they are frequently asked in examinations. The period begins with the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons in Britain around 450 AD and ends with the Norman conquest in 1066. These two historical events mark the boundaries of the Old English period. Many students confuse this concept, so let me explain it in a simpler way. Imagine that English literature is a very large tree. Before the tree could grow branches, flowers, and fruits, it first needed roots. The literature of the Old English period represents those roots. Without understanding these roots, it becomes difficult to appreciate the later achievements of writers such as Geoffrey Chaucer, William Shakespeare, John Milton, William Wordsworth, Charles Dickens, or T.S. Eliot. Everything begins here. Now the first question that naturally comes to our minds is this: who were the Anglo-Saxons? Let's understand this together. The Anglo-Saxons were not a single tribe. They were actually a collection of Germanic tribes, mainly the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. These tribes originally lived in different regions of northern Europe. Around the middle of the 5th century, they crossed the North Sea and settled in Britain. Over time, they established their own kingdoms and gradually became the dominant population in England. Please remember one interesting fact. The word England itself comes from the word Angleland, meaning the land of the Angles. This shows how influential these tribes became in shaping the identity of the country. As I always tell my students, history and literature always go hand in hand. When these Germanic tribes came to Britain, they did not simply bring weapons or military strength. They also brought their language, their customs, their traditions, their beliefs, and most importantly, their stories. These stories were passed down from one generation to another and eventually became the earliest literary heritage of England. At this point, you should ask another important question. What kind of society did the Anglo-Saxons build? The answer is very interesting. The Anglo-Saxon world was primarily a warrior society. Strength was admired. Courage was respected. Loyalty was considered the greatest virtue. A person earned honor through bravery on the battlefield. Success in war meant glory not only for an individual warrior but also for his family and his people. Now I want you to understand one of the most important concepts in Old English literature. This concept is known as the heroic code. Please pay special attention because this concept is extremely important for university examinations. The heroic code was a set of values that every warrior was expected to follow. According to this code, A warrior had to remain loyal to his lord under all circumstances. He had to defend his people, protect his kingdom, fight fearlessly against enemies, and never abandon his companions during battle. Many students simply memorize the definition of the heroic code, but I always recommend my students to understand its practical meaning. Imagine two soldiers fighting side by side. Even if one of them knows that defeat is certain, he still refuses to leave his companion because loyalty is more valuable than life itself. This was the ideal behavior admired by Anglo-Saxon society, and this ideal appears repeatedly in Old English epic poetry. Closely related to the heroic code is another important concept known as the comitatus. Let's understand this together. The word comitatus refers to the special relationship between a king and his warriors. The king was expected to protect his followers, reward them with treasure, land, weapons, and honor, while the warriors were expected to remain completely loyal to their king, even if it meant sacrificing their own lives. This relationship was not based on fear. It was based on mutual trust, mutual respect, and shared responsibility. Whenever you read Beowulf later in this course, you will notice that this relationship between the Lord and his warriors appears throughout the poem. Therefore, understanding the concept of comitatus today will make Beowulf much easier to understand in our next lectures. Now let us move toward another important aspect of Anglo-Saxon life. Religion played a very significant role during this period. Initially, the Anglo-Saxons followed pagan beliefs. They worshipped various gods connected with nature, war, and destiny. Their worldview was strongly influenced by ideas of courage, fate, and the uncertainty of human life. However, during the 6th and 7th centuries, Christianity gradually spread throughout England. Christian missionaries introduced new religious beliefs, new educational institutions, and most importantly, the practice of writing. Please pay special attention to this point because it is very important for examinations. Before Christianity, most stories were preserved through oral tradition. After Christianity spread across England, monks began recording these stories in written form. If these monks had not copied the poems into manuscripts, much of Old English literature would have disappeared forever. As I always tell my students, sometimes the greatest heroes of literature are not only the poets but also the people who preserve literature. Without the dedication of medieval scribes working in monasteries, we would probably never have been able to read Beowulf today. Now another interesting question arises. Did Christianity completely replace the older Germanic traditions? The answer is no. This is one of the most fascinating features of Old English literature. Instead of completely rejecting their older beliefs, Anglo-Saxon poets combined pagan traditions with Christian ideas. As a result, we find literature in which brave warriors seek everlasting fame, while poets also remind readers that God is the supreme ruler of the universe. Many students become confused when they see both pagan and Christian elements in the same poem. They assume that this is a contradiction. Actually, it is not a contradiction at all. It reflects a society that was passing through a period of religious and cultural transformation. The poets respected the heroic traditions of their ancestors while also accepting the teachings of Christianity. This unique combination gives Old English literature its special character. It is one of the reasons why scholars continue to study these poems even today. Now, before we move to the next major topic, I want to summarize what we have learned so far. We have understood that the Old English period extends from 450 AD to 1066 AD. We have learned who the Anglo-Saxons were and how they established their culture in England. We have discussed the heroic code and the concept of comitatus. Finally, We have seen how pagan beliefs and Christian values gradually blended together to create a unique literary tradition. As I always tell my students, never study literature without understanding its historical background. Once the background becomes clear, every poem becomes much easier to interpret. In the next part of this lecture, we will explore how Old English poetry was actually composed and performed. We will discuss the oral tradition, the role of the scop, the atmosphere of the mead hall, and the remarkable poetic techniques such as alliteration, kennings, and variation that made Old English epic poetry one of the greatest literary traditions in the world. Now, my dear students, let's continue our discussion from where we left off. We have already understood the historical background of the Old English period, the Anglo-Saxon society, the heroic code, the concept of comitatus, and the influence of Christianity. Now, the next important question is this: how was literature actually created during this period? As I always tell my students, before we study a literary work, we should first understand how it reached the audience. Today, if an author writes a novel or a poem, it is published in books or uploaded online. Readers can access it instantly. But during the Old English period, the situation was completely different. Let's understand this together. During the 5th, 6th, and even much of the 7th century, very few people could read or write. There were no printing presses, no publishing houses, no libraries in the modern sense, and certainly no internet or digital media. Therefore, literature survived through memory and performance rather than through written books. This system is known as the oral tradition. Please pay special attention to this point because it is very important for examinations. The oral tradition means that stories, poems, legends, and historical events were passed from one generation to another by speaking and listening. A father narrated heroic stories to his children. Elderly warriors described famous battles to younger generations. Professional poets memorized thousands of lines of poetry and performed them before large audiences. Many students think that oral literature was somehow inferior to written literature. I want you to understand that this is not true. In fact, memorizing and performing such long poems required extraordinary intelligence, creativity, and discipline. Imagine memorizing more than 3,000 lines of poetry without making mistakes. That is exactly what many Old English poets were capable of doing. Now, the next important question is, who were these poets? These poets were known as scops. I always recommend my students to remember this word because it frequently appears in examination questions. The word scop refers to a professional poet or singer in Anglo-Saxon society. A scop was much more than an entertainer. He was a historian, a storyteller, a musician, and a guardian of cultural memory. His responsibility was to preserve the achievements of kings, celebrate the bravery of warriors, and ensure that great heroes were never forgotten. As I always tell my students, before history was written in books, it was preserved in songs. This is exactly the role performed by the scop. Whenever a king achieved a great military victory, or whenever a courageous warrior sacrificed his life for his people, the scop transformed these events into poetry. Through his performances, these heroic deeds became part of the collective memory of society. Now let us imagine the environment in which these performances took place. Most performances occurred inside a magnificent building known as the mead hall. Let's understand why the mead hall was so important. The mead hall was not simply a place where people gathered for food and drink. It was the political, social, and cultural center of Anglo-Saxon life. Kings welcomed their warriors there. Important decisions were made there. Victories were celebrated there. Guests were received there. Most importantly, the scop recited heroic poetry there. One of the most famous mead halls in English literature is Heorot, which appears in the epic poem Beowulf. We shall study it in detail during our next lecture. But for now, remember that Heorot symbolizes civilization, unity, generosity, and social harmony. Imagine a large wooden hall illuminated by the warm glow of fire. Warriors have returned from battle. Their swords and shields rest beside them. The king distributes gifts to his loyal followers. Everyone sits together while the scop begins singing stories of ancient heroes. Through his powerful voice, listeners relive battles, victories, sacrifices, and unforgettable moments from the past. Can you see how different this experience was from reading a modern book silently? This is why Old English poetry was designed to be heard rather than simply read. Now another important question arises. If these poems were performed orally, how did poets remember such long compositions? The answer lies in the remarkable poetic techniques they used. The first and perhaps the most important technique is alliteration. Please pay special attention to this concept because it is one of the defining characteristics of Old English poetry. Many students confuse alliteration with rhyme, but these are completely different concepts. In modern English poetry, poets often create musical beauty by making the ending sounds of words similar. This is called rhyme. However, Old English poets rarely depended on rhyme. Instead, they created rhythm through alliteration. Let's understand this together. Alliteration is the repetition of the same initial consonant sound in nearby words. For example, if several important words in a line begin with the letter B, such as brave, battle, blood, and bold, the repeated B sound creates a strong musical effect. This repetition helped both the poet and the audience. The poet found it easier to remember long passages, while the listeners found it easier to follow the rhythm of the performance. As I always tell my students, remember this simple examination tip. If someone asks you to identify the most important stylistic feature of Old English poetry, your first answer should be alliteration. Now let us move one step further. Old English poetic lines were carefully organized. Each line was divided into two halves by a natural pause called a caesura. Please remember this literary term. A caesura simply means a pause within a poetic line. When the scop performed the poem, he naturally paused in the middle before continuing the second half. This pause made the performance more dramatic and allowed the audience to absorb the meaning of each line. Many students become frightened when they hear literary terms like caesura. There is absolutely no need to worry. Think of it simply as a deliberate pause that gives emphasis and rhythm to the spoken words. Now, another fascinating feature of Old English poetry is the use of kennings. As I always tell my students, this is one of the most beautiful aspects of Anglo-Saxon imagination. Instead of using ordinary vocabulary, poets often described familiar objects through imaginative compound expressions. For example, rather than saying sea, they might call it the whale road. Why whale road? Because whales travel through the sea just as human beings travel along roads. Similarly, instead of saying ship, they might use the expression sea steed. A horse carries a rider across the land. A ship carries sailors across the sea. Therefore, the ship becomes the sea steed. Likewise, the human body could be described as the bone house, because our bones form the framework that houses the body. The king was often called the ring giver. Many students ask me why a king was called the ring giver. The answer is very simple. Anglo-Saxon kings rewarded loyal warriors with rings, gold, weapons, and valuable treasures. Therefore, The king became known as the ring-giver because generosity was one of the greatest qualities expected from a ruler. Please pay special attention to these examples because they are frequently quoted in university examinations. Now think carefully about what these kennings achieve. They do much more than decorate the language. They encourage readers and listeners to imagine ordinary objects in fresh and creative ways. They also demonstrate the poet's imagination and artistic skill. As I always tell my students, good literature does not merely tell us something. It helps us see familiar things from a completely new perspective. In the next part of our lecture, we shall study another important stylistic feature known as variation. Then we will connect all these poetic techniques with the epic Beowulf and understand why Old English poetry has remained influential for more than 1,000 years. Now, my dear students, let us continue our discussion from where we stopped. In the previous part of our lecture, we discussed the oral tradition, the role of the scop, the importance of the mead hall, alliteration, and kennings. I hope all these concepts are becoming clear because, as I always tell my students, once you understand the foundation of Old English poetry, understanding Beowulf becomes much easier. Now, let's move to another important literary feature of Old English poetry known as variation. Many students confuse this concept, so let me explain it in a simpler way. Variation is a poetic technique in which the poet repeats the same idea using different words or expressions. Instead of introducing a completely new idea, the poet presents the same person, object, or event from another perspective. This repetition is not unnecessary. Rather, it adds beauty, emphasis, and clarity to the poem. Let's understand this together. Suppose a poet wants to describe a king. Instead of mentioning the king's name repeatedly, he may first call him the king, then the ring-giver, then the protector of warriors, and then the treasure guardian. Although different expressions are used, they all refer to the same individual. Now you may ask, why did poets use this technique? There are several reasons. First, variation made oral performance much easier. Since the poems were recited from memory, the poet had greater flexibility in choosing different expressions while maintaining the rhythm of the poem. Second, variation prevented unnecessary repetition of the same word and made the language more elegant. Third, it helped listeners understand the importance of the character being described. As I always tell my students, whenever you see several different descriptions referring to the same person in Old English poetry, you should immediately recognize that this is the technique of variation. Now let us discuss another interesting characteristic of Old English poetry, which is known as formulaic expression. Although the term may sound technical, the idea is actually very simple. Formulaic expressions are phrases that poets used repeatedly in different poems and performances. Since oral poets had to compose and perform lengthy narratives without written notes, they relied on familiar expressions that could easily fit into different situations. For example, expressions praising a brave warrior, describing a dangerous sea voyage, introducing a king, or announcing the beginning of a battle could be reused with slight modifications. Think of it this way. Even today, teachers often repeat certain expressions in every class. I frequently say, as I always tell my students, or please pay special attention to this point because it is very important for examinations. These expressions become part of my teaching style. Similarly, the Anglo-Saxon scop had his own familiar expressions that helped him maintain the flow of the performance. Now another important question arises. Why has Beowulf remained the most famous Old English epic for more than 1,000 years? Let's understand this together. The answer lies not only in its exciting story but also in its literary excellence. Beowulf is much more than a tale about monsters. It is a profound exploration of leadership, courage, sacrifice, loyalty, mortality, and the responsibilities of a good ruler. Many students think that Beowulf is simply a fantasy because it contains monsters and dragons. However, if you read the poem carefully, you will discover that every battle has a symbolic meaning. Grendel represents evil, violence, and social disorder. Grendel's mother represents revenge and the continuation of violence. The dragon represents destruction, greed, and the inevitable reality of death. Beowulf's struggle against these enemies symbolizes humanity's constant struggle against fear, evil, and mortality. As I always tell my students, great literature always operates on two levels. On the surface, it tells an interesting story. Beneath the surface, it explores universal human experiences. This is precisely why Beowulf continues to be studied in universities all over the world. Now let us examine another important concept that appears throughout Old English literature. This concept is known by the Old English word wird. Please pay special attention to this term because it is extremely important for examinations. Wird simply means fate or destiny. The Anglo-Saxons believed that every human being had a predetermined destiny. A courageous warrior could fight bravely, but he could never completely escape his fate. This does not mean that they believed human effort was useless. On the contrary, they admired individuals who faced their destiny with courage. Imagine two warriors. One runs away from danger because he fears death. The other knows that death may be unavoidable, yet he continues fighting bravely. Which one would Anglo-Saxon society admire? Obviously, the second warrior. This is why courage occupies such a central position in Old English literature. The greatest hero is not the one who avoids danger. The greatest hero is the one who confronts danger with dignity and honor. I always recommend my students to remember this examination point. Heroism in Old English literature is measured not by survival but by courage. Now let us discuss another remarkable characteristic of Old English poetry. Almost every major poem reflects an elegiac mood. Many students become confused when they hear the word elegiac. Let me explain it in a simpler way. An elegiac mood is a feeling of sadness, reflection, and awareness that everything in this world is temporary. The Anglo-Saxons understood that kingdoms rise and fall. Great kings eventually die. Powerful warriors grow old. Magnificent halls are destroyed. Even the strongest civilizations cannot escape the passage of time. Therefore, beneath all the celebrations of bravery and victory, Old English poetry constantly reminds us that worldly glory is temporary. This idea gives Old English literature a unique emotional depth. As I always tell my students, Beowulf is not simply a poem about victory. It is also a poem about loss. It celebrates courage while simultaneously reminding us that every human achievement eventually comes to an end. Now let us return to an important historical question. If these poems originally belonged to an oral tradition, how did they survive until today? The answer brings us back to the Christian monasteries that we discussed earlier. After Christianity spread throughout England, monks began copying poems onto parchment manuscripts. One of the most famous surviving manuscripts is known as the Noel Codex. It is within this manuscript that Beowulf has been preserved. Please remember this important fact. Only one complete manuscript of Beowulf has survived. Imagine how easily this masterpiece could have disappeared forever. If that single manuscript had been destroyed by fire, war, or neglect, one of the greatest works of English literature might have been permanently lost. As I always tell my students, sometimes history survives by the smallest margin. The preservation of Beowulf reminds us of the importance of libraries, manuscripts, and scholars who dedicate their lives to preserving literature for future generations. Now let me ask you a question. What makes Old English poetry different from modern English poetry? By this point, I hope you can answer confidently. Old English poetry depends upon alliteration rather than rhyme. It uses kennings instead of ordinary vocabulary. It employs variation to emphasize important ideas. It developed through oral performance rather than silent reading. It celebrates heroic values such as courage, loyalty, generosity, and honor. Finally, it combines pagan traditions with Christian beliefs in a remarkably balanced way. If you can remember these characteristics, you will already possess a strong understanding of Old English epic poetry. In the next and final part of today's lecture, we shall bring everything together. We will discuss the lasting influence of Old English epic poetry, understand why it remains significant even today, revise all the important examination points, and conclude today's lecture with a comprehensive summary that will help you remember every major concept we have discussed. Now, my dear students, we have reached the final part of today's lecture. I hope you have been following every concept carefully because, as I always tell my students, the more clearly you understand the foundations of English literature, the easier it becomes to study every literary period that follows. So far, we have discussed the historical background of the Old English period, the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, the heroic code, the concept of comitatus, the influence of Christianity, the oral tradition, the role of the scop, the importance of the mead hall, and the distinctive features of Old English poetry such as alliteration, kennings, variation, and the idea of WIRD or fate. Now let us ask one final question. Why is Old English epic poetry still important today? Let's understand this together. Some students think that because these poems were written more than 1,000 years ago, they have little relevance to modern readers. I completely disagree with this idea. Great literature never becomes outdated because it deals with universal human experiences. Human beings still admire courage. We still respect loyalty. We still appreciate sacrifice. We still struggle against fear, injustice, and uncertainty. These emotions have remained the same throughout history. That is why Old English poetry continues to speak to readers across different centuries and cultures. Please pay special attention to this point because it is very important for examinations. When you are asked about the significance of Old English epic poetry, never write only that it is the earliest English literature. Explain that it preserves the beliefs, values, social structure, religious transition, and cultural identity of the Anglo-Saxons. It also provides the foundation upon which later English literature developed. As I always tell my students, every literary age inherits something from the previous age. The Old English period introduced heroic ideals, elevated poetic language, and a tradition of storytelling that continued to influence English literature for centuries. Although the Norman conquest of 1066 brought enormous political and linguistic changes to England, the achievements of Old English literature were never completely forgotten. Later medieval writers inherited many ideas from the Anglo-Saxon tradition. Even though the language changed, themes such as bravery, honor, loyalty, and moral responsibility continued to appear in English literature. Now let me mention a famous 20th century scholar whose name you should remember. His name is J.R.R. Tolkien. Many students know Tolkien as the author of The Lord of the Rings, but they do not realize that he was also one of the greatest scholars of Old English literature. As I always tell my students, a good reader should always know the connection between different literary works. Tolkien spent many years studying Beowulf. He admired its artistic beauty, its heroic spirit, and its imaginative world. In fact, many scholars believe that his own fictional writings were deeply inspired by Old English literature. Think about the heroic warriors, ancient kings, dragons, magical swords, monsters, treasure, and epic battles that appear in Tolkien's novels. These elements remind us of the world of Beowulf. This shows that literature from 1,000 years ago continues to inspire modern writers. Now I want you to understand another important lesson. Literature is not simply a collection of stories. Literature is the memory of civilization. When we study Old English poetry, we are not merely reading ancient verses. We are entering the thoughts, fears, hopes, beliefs, and dreams of people who lived more than a millennium ago. Their language may be different from ours. Their society may be different from ours. But their emotions remain surprisingly familiar. That is the true power of literature. Now, before we conclude today's lecture, let us revise all the important examination points together. As I always tell my students, revision is the key to success. If you revise immediately after studying a topic, you will remember it for a much longer time. First, remember the time period. The Old English period extends from approximately 450 AD to 1066 AD. It begins with the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain and ends with the Norman conquest. Second, remember who the Anglo-Saxons were. They were Germanic tribes consisting mainly of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes who settled in Britain and laid the foundations of English language and literature. Third, remember the heroic code. It emphasized courage, honor, loyalty, generosity, and the willingness to sacrifice one's life for one's lord and community. Fourth, remember the concept of comitatus. It refers to the relationship of mutual loyalty between a king and his warriors. The king protected and rewarded his followers, while the warriors defended their king with complete devotion. Fifth, remember that Old English poetry originally belonged to an oral tradition. Before poems were written down, they were memorized and performed by professional poets known as scops in the mead halls of kings. Sixth, remember the major literary features of Old English poetry. The most important of these are alliteration, kennings, variation, and formulaic expressions. Seventh, remember the meaning of WYRD. WYRD refers to fate or destiny. The Anglo-Saxons believed that although human beings could not escape fate, they could face it with courage and dignity. Eighth, remember that Old English literature combines pagan traditions with Christian beliefs. This fusion gives the literature its distinctive character and philosophical depth. Finally, remember the greatest epic of the Old English period. The answer is Beowulf. Please pay special attention to this point because it is one of the most frequently asked examination questions. Many students make the mistake of memorizing isolated facts without understanding their relationships. I always recommend my students to think of today's lecture as one complete picture. The Anglo-Saxons created a warrior society. That society valued heroism and loyalty. Those values produced epic poetry. Epic poetry was preserved through oral tradition. Professional scops performed the poems. The poems employed alliteration, kennings, and variation. Christian monks later wrote these poems down. Beowulf became the greatest surviving example of this literary tradition. When you connect all these ideas, the entire Old English period becomes logical and easy to remember. As I always tell my students, learning literature is not about memorizing pages of information. It is about understanding how history, society, religion, language, and imagination come together to create great works of art. In our next lecture, we shall begin the detailed study of Beowulf itself. We will explore its complete story, analyze its major characters, understand its symbolic meanings, examine its literary techniques, and discuss why it is regarded as one of the greatest epics in world literature. So, before attending the next lecture, I encourage you to revise today's concepts once again. If your understanding of today's lecture is clear, you will enjoy the next lecture even more because every event in Beowulf is connected to the ideas we have discussed today. I hope today's lecture helped you understand the topic clearly. If you found this lecture useful, continue learning with the next lecture in this series. Thank you for your time.
Allah Hafiz.